deals. We had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones. So those are really, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in. Well, let's do the destabilization thing if we go first.
Well, that's what I meant.
Okay,
I thought Africa was a good example.
It is a good example.
So
is the Middle East, so South America. Well, yeah, chaos, mayhem, destabilization are the friends of exploitation. And so if you can have internal problems in a country, then it's ripe for exploitation. It's the old divide and conquer. So, for example, in the Middle East, the fact that Sunnis and Shiites and Israelis all are at each other's throats works to the advantage of oil companies, because the divide and conquer, if they all came together and found the common enemy, which is the exploiting people, then the oil companies wouldn't have a chance. But as long as they can keep it destabilized. And in South America, it's fascinating how we've seen that throughout the history of Latin America, the indigenous people in the military have usually been opposed ever since the time of the conquest. But in the recent elections in places like Ecuador and Venezuela and Bolivia, these two groups have come together. They've united. And as a result, now you have this amazing revolution that's going on in South America, which is not pleasing to U.S. corporotocracy. And we really blew it there, and from that standpoint, in that the destabilization is no longer happening. These diverse groups have come together because they've realized it's to their self-interest to stick together to fight the common enemy, which is the corporotocracy, which is us, really. And Africa is an amazing example. Because who's ever heard of Africa? I mean, we hear the name Africa, but who knows anything about Africa? What do we know about coltan in the Congo? What do we really know about diamonds in so many of these countries? What do we really know about oil in the Sudan? We hear these things, but we don't really know much. What we like to say, the American people like to say, the American press likes to say, oh, it's those corrupt leaders. We don't ask who corrupted them. Leaders are not corrupt. They are corrupted. Somebody does it. And we say, tribal warfare. Well, who's creating the tribal warfare? It's been to the advantage of the British, the French, the Dutch, the Germans, whoever happened to be there, now us, to foster this kind of instability, this antagonism, the antagonism between Muslims and Christians and Jews. This goes on. And I think Africa is truly the canary in the cave, in the mine. And it's a dying canary, It's terribly dying. And we don't even look. We don't know. And another problem with Africa is that the people in our own country whose heritage is African, the African Americans, for the most part, don't even know where they were from. They don't know what language their ancestors spoke. So it's hard for them to really relate. Unlike Latin America, for example, we can't really do something in Venezuela or Colombia or Bolivia without people in this country taking note, because a lot of those people are from there. We got a lot of people here in this country from Venezuela and Colombia and Bolivia and so on, and they're interested. And they know where they're from, and they can read the local papers. They can read Spanish. But in Africa, our African heritage people don't even know where they're from, and they don't read those papers. And so there's been this huge mask that's been thrown over Africa. I mean, it truly is a dark continent from the point of view of we don't let light in. The media doesn't understand what's going on. It doesn't want to. And the corporotocracy surely don't want us to understand. I mean, the corporations do everything they can to foment turmoil, mayhem, instability, chaos there, and to keep the information from reaching the American public, from even reaching the press, because that serves their interests best. Forget about Chads, forget about Solon. Well, don't forget about them, but put them aside for a moment and just deal with the bigger issue, which is the American public really doesn't know what we're voting for. And we're seeing in the presidential campaigns, that there's an ignorance or there's an avoidance of what's really going on. We don't really talk about the causes behind the immigration problem. We talk about the band-aids to cure it. Should we build a wall? Should we make stricter laws? Should we invite these people to become citizens? But the real issue is the fact that we've destroyed the economies in their countries through our free trade agreements that have benefited the big corporations hugely, but have made everybody else suffer. The workers in the United States, the workers in Guatemala and Mexico and throughout Central America and many parts of South America are suffering terribly. Not one of them wants to be here. I speak Spanish. I live in Florida. I go out and I talk to the Guatemalans who are taking care of everybody's lawns and doing a lot of the other menial work. They don't want to be here. They're not getting rich here. They're sending all their money home. They want to be back in Guatemala or Mexico or Honduras or El Salvador, wherever they're from. These are beautiful countries. They want to be there. There's no work there. And there's no work there because of the laws that we've passed, because of the IMF, because of the World Bank, because of what the corporotocracy is doing to exploit these countries. So if we really want to deal with the immigration problem, that's what we must do, is help these countries get back on their feet and open their doors to their own people to have jobs there. But our presidential candidates aren't addressing that. Although, you know, at least back in the 70s, and I'm writing about this now in the book I'm working on now, that I was called into Washington to the Army and Navy Club, met with a lot of retired generals and admirals to talk about a job that was going on in the Indian Ocean. And I found that, and I found this to be the case, that at the top echelons of the military, they don't want to go to war. You know, they know that that's just going to create more problems. They know that if you want to create terrorism, you know, send in the army. The lower echelons are uneducated about that, don't understand. But the highest echelons, I think, in general, the military doesn't want to go to war. The politicians want to go to war. The corporations want to go to war. Because every corporation many corporations stand to make a tremendous amount of money out of war. So you and I may think that Vietnam was a failure and that Iraq is a failure. But if you own a big industry that has any relationship whatsoever to the war machine, and that includes insurance companies and banks, and includes companies we don't usually think of as being part of the military-industrial complex. If you happen to be the CEO or a major owner of any of those corporations, you think that Vietnam was a huge success, and so is Iraq. How about if we use what just happened in Colombia, between Colombia and Ecuador, you know?
Oh, yes, please.
As an example.
Sure, that's a great example.
And I was in Nicaragua at the time, so I got an interesting perspective, which was very different from the U.S.
I'm sure.
Press here. In fact, I was supposed to be meeting with Ortega, but he had to fly out the morning I was supposed to meet with him to go to Santo Domingo early for this meeting that was held with all the heads of states of Latin America, basically condemned Uribe of Colombia. But if we look at the situation in Colombia, which is let me think of the word here. If we look at the situation in Colombia, which is symbolic of so many, you go back to the time when I was in Colombia in the 70s, and I was there to get huge World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank loans for Colombia to build infrastructure projects using U.S. corporations to do it. Particularly, we were building big hydroelectric dams, transmission lines, pipelines, those sorts of things. And the poor people of Colombia objected very, very strongly, the campesinos, the majority of the people. For example, we would dam up rivers to create hydroelectric projects and destroy vast amounts of farmlands, destroy towns. And then we would build transmission lines from these across llanos and jungles and through people's backyards and these big transmission towers. But the people who lived in those areas didn't get any electricity. They got absolutely no benefits. And they were outraged. And so they formed what we would call guerrilla groups, sort of like the Boston Minutemen. And it was fascinating that my company, Charles T. Main, we had offices in Barranquilla and in Bogota, Colombia. We were designing these huge projects. We were not allowed to send any U.S. citizens, engineers, to the project site, only Colombians, because it was too dangerous. The guerrillas, as we call them, would come down and attack the construction camps. And they would send the workers down the river in canoes. They didn't hurt them, but they scared them. And this went on and on. And meanwhile, now oil exploration is starting in other parts of Colombia, and similar things are happening there. The campesinos are very strongly objecting to oil, and the guerrillas would come in. And originally they were supported financially by Russia and China to a certain degree, and to a certain degree by Cuba. And of course we then painted them as being communists Most of them didn't care at all about philosophy. They just simply wanted to have their lands. These were desperate people. Their lands were being destroyed. Their families were starving. And they wanted to get us out of there. And they wanted not to have this happen anymore. But we accused them of being communists. Well, as communist funds began to dry up, as things happened in Russia and China and Cuba, that funds began to dry up, they turned to extortion, blackmail, kidnapping, and drugs as a way of financing themselves. And over time, that became much more a part of their business. It was one of their few ways of financing themselves. You know, we all think détente is such a great thing, the peace between the Soviet Union and the United States. But there's a dark side to that, too. There was a balance when the Soviet Union was there. If the United States put too much pressure on a country to bend to our will, the country would sort of slip off toward Russia, and then we would back off the position. Once the Soviet Union was gone, there was nobody for anybody to turn to, except terrorism, in essence. And so today we have a situation, for example, in Colombia, where you have these organizations like FARC that to a large degree are financed through drugs and extortion and other illegal activities, but their basis is in defense of the people to a very large degree. And recently, I was in Nicaragua at the time. Colombia, President Uribe, sent troops into Ecuador to take out the leader of FARC, who was that particular leader, who actually, according to my sources, was in Ecuador to negotiate a peace settlement and arrange for a hostage exchange. He and about 20 other people of his group were all killed by the Colombian president. And of course, Correa, the president of Ecuador, objected very, very strongly. And Hugo Chavez joined in with Correa, and there was a huge conflict about this. And all of the presidents of South America met in Santo Domingo, and they all condemned Uribe. But the United States defended him, including all three presidential candidates, Clinton, Obama, and McCain, all came to Colombia's defense, which was absurd. One of the things that was happening there is Colombia is the largest recipient in the hemisphere, one of the largest in the world, of U.S. military foreign aid to fight these FARC people. Uribe doesn't want peace with FARC because then his funds dry up. And really what that money is used for more than anything else is to defend our oil companies in Colombia and the construction of pipelines. So we use this excuse, whether it's called communism back in the old days, the Red Scare, or whether it's called Al-Qaeda or terrorism or whatever it is, we find these enemies, and in fact we create these enemies. And this gives us a foothold into the country so we can have our military in there and we can use them to defend our oil companies, which in the case of Colombia and Ecuador and throughout so much of Latin America are terribly, terribly exploitative and destroy environments, destroy people. The largest environmental lawsuit in the history of the world today is being brought on behalf of 30,000 Ecuadorian Amazonian people against Texaco, which is now owned by Chevron. So today it's against Chevron, but for activities conducted by Texaco throughout the years of dumping, which is estimated to be more than 18 times more than what the Exxon Valdez dumped into the coast of Alaska. In the case of Ecuador, it wasn't an accident. The oil companies did it intentionally. They knew they were doing it to save money out there rather than arranging for proper disposal.
Yeah, that's unbelievable.
It is.
It's so blind because they're just killing themselves in the end.
Well, they make a hell of a lot of money in the process.
Right.
And none of these executives expect to be, to hold their job for more than a few years anyway. So
right.
Make a killing while you're there.
Whatever you want to go with that. I know it's kind of an obscure question.
So in 1971, the United States was very much in debt as we are today, and foreign companies started. Wait, let me set that over again.
Okay.
So in 1971, the United States was very deeply in debt, as it is today, and we were on the gold standard. And so other countries began to call in the debt in gold. They didn't want dollars; they wanted gold. We couldn't pay it, and so Nixon and his buddies took us off the gold standard. And of course the argument at the time was made that there's no economic reason to be on a gold standard, but the truth of the matter is we couldn't pay. We were bankrupt. We couldn't pay in gold. So we simply went off the gold standard and said, here, we'll pay you in dollars, but we'll need to back it up with gold. But that then threatened to undermine the dollar as the world currency because it put it in huge question. So in 1973, when the OPEC oil embargo hit, it created an ideal opportunity to do something that was even better than the gold